It's a rainy, raw afternoon in Sausalito, California. As I sit here overlooking Richardson Bay, I can barely see Tiburon on the other side, Angel Island. Just barely make it out. Oakland and the Bay Bridge are completely obscured at this point, but the weather has been great. So one day of gray, rainy, damp weather, I can live with that. Had an interesting conversation not too long ago with Benjamin Zander. He's the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra and the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra. His mission has been to use music both as a message and medium to teach us all about leadership, teamwork, the art of possibility, and life. I'm BJ Fennell. Benjamin Zander joins us this time on Take Me Through It.
Take Me Through It is made possible by people like you. Thank you for downloading, listening, and subscribing. And leave us a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
Benjamin Zander is founder, musical director, and conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra and the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra. And we sat down with Ben and asked him about the beauty, mystery, and magic of music, why and how it affects us so physically and so emotionally.
Why do you fall in love with a woman? Because her voice is beautiful. That's a very hard thing to answer. I have no real answer to that question. It's a mystery. It's a miracle. Why the sound of an orchestra or a sound of an individual player is intoxicating or ravishing. Or I was in a class yesterday at the Walnut Hill School where I had 60 young high school age musicians, and a girl played the violin very beautifully. And then I told her about the period from which this music came, and I played a tape of my teacher playing the cello, and I hear the sound coming up, playing a beautiful piece by Chopin on the cello, and the sound was ravishing, it was intoxicating, it was mind-blowing actually. And I could see that all these 60 musicians were in trance as if they'd been drugged. And then the young girl took her violin and played a totally different sound than she played before she heard that. And what happened? What was the mystery there? What got into her spirit? What got into their spirit? That it's just vibrations going through the air. And it's a mystery why we can bring tears to our eyes, we can have memories, we can have deep feelings, deep resonances as a result of some vibrations going through the air. And it's a mystery, and if we knew how it worked, we would always be able to do it. It's like if they knew how Stradivarius made his violins perfect, we would be producing violins like that, but we don't. So it's one of the mysteries of life. Sound, why harmonies make the effect they do on people it's not completely mysterious, because in the tonal system of music, which is most of our music, we have a certain expectation that's built up. If I sing a scale, da da dee da 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 dee, that last note is missing something. It has built into it a desire to be resolved to the next note. Da dee da da dee da dee da. And everybody wants that. Everybody knows that last note is going up to its resolution. So, and that's in nature. That's not an invented thing. That's actually in nature that exists. So in a way, it's beyond human beings. It's something we tap into, but it's not something we created. We didn't invent that. And so that's a given, and it's everybody in the world feels it, which is why popular songs are popular everywhere. It's not as if the Japanese don't respond to Frank Sinatra. They respond just like everybody else does, or to Mozart or to Bach. So that's built in, and that's, lots been written about that and talked about that, and that's the language we speak. And how one musician touches people and inspires them and another doesn't is partly a mystery and partly unteachable. So although I spend my life trying to teach people, and I do, and create obviously and often many transformations and breakthroughs. The format for the Boston Philharmonic is very clear. We have 4 concerts a year, 4 programs, which we repeat 3 times. And the programs are very challenging. It's a large orchestra. There are nearly 100 players. I think it's 93 players. And we always do programs which are very demanding. And so we work intensively for 3 weeks. I mean, not every day, but 5, 6 rehearsals, 7 rehearsals altogether. And then we perform it 3 times. And each time I put together a program which is very stimulating for the audience and exciting for the audience, and very stimulating and exciting for the players. So it's got to be something there that is challenging for them, technically and emotionally and musically. And then I usually find something in the music which is fresh and new, which is not traditional in the performance. In the case of Beethoven, I've just finished a recording of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, which is going to absolutely startle people when they hear it, because there are so many parts of the piece that have been, in my view, as best I can tell, misrepresented in the way that they're played from what he seems to have intended, mostly to do with tempo. And so I'll stretch the audience, the orchestra, to the limit of their capacity to realize the idea that the composer had in mind. The conductor makes all the sounds, because the way that a conductor draws his hands through the air causes the players to respond with exactly the sound that he or she, and I'll say he, but I mean she also, that the sound that every instrumentalist makes is actually controlled by those hands. So I can create a heavy sound, a dark sound, a light sound, a tender sound, a passionate sound, an aggressive sound, all just with my hands, which is an amazing thing to realize. And one very great musician said to me one day a very interesting thing. He said, if you have 5 orchestras and 1 conductor, you've got 1 orchestra. If you have 5 conductors and 1 orchestra, you've got 5 orchestras, which is a fascinating idea, that actually each conductor has his sound, and whether he's conducting one orchestra or another, I mean, within limits. You can't exaggerate, because if you take an orchestra like the Boston Symphony or the Philadelphia Orchestra, they have a sound which is characteristic of them. But it's interesting that if I go to a new orchestra, which I do a lot, every time I essentially end up, after the rehearsal period, with an orchestra that sounds like the Boston Philharmonic. Part of my job is to create an environment in which there's great respect between the members of the orchestra, in which all the people feel valued at all times, whatever their level, whatever they're doing, and encouraged and inspired by the music and by whatever I can illuminate in the music for them, so that they are engaged intellectually and emotionally at all times during the rehearsals. The rehearsals are very long. It's 4 hours, Saturday afternoon, for a 12-year-old to rehearse for 4 hours a Mahler symphony. For instance, at the moment we're doing the Mahler Ninth Symphony. It's one of the most challenging, some might say the most challenging work in the entire musical literature. And we're taking it on tour to Europe and playing it in many different cities in Europe, in Berlin and in Amsterdam and in Budapest and in Salzburg and in Vienna, in the great halls in which these pieces were played by the composer. It's incredible. We're playing in the Amsterdam Concertgebouw and the Vienna Musikverein, which were the places where Mahler himself conducted and heard his music. And these traditions are cherished and revered, these works. So to take a group of kids of that age through that process is a life-changing experience for them. They'll never forget it, and they'll grow in immensely in every aspect of their lives. We'll go to the home where Mahler was born, plant a rose tree in the garden of his home, and it's going to be an extraordinary experience. And all the time playing his music and getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it, understanding it more and more, mastering it more and more. And by the end, they'll know it from memory. They'll probably play the last performance from memory. It's an hour and a half of music, some of the most difficult, complex, deep, challenging, spiritually uplifting music that exists. And so complicated that in the days when it was new, people couldn't understand it. The Halle Orchestra, which was the first orchestra in England that played the Mahler Ninth with Sir John Barbaroli, had 50 rehearsals, 50 rehearsals in order to master it. Now I'm doing it with the children's orchestra, with some children in it, which is kind of extraordinary. I mean, it's a miraculous thing that one can do that. Most of them come from Boston. Some of them come from New Hampshire, some of them come from Vermont, some of them come from Western Massachusetts, and a few come from very considerable distances, 3-4 hours of driving each weekend. And one of them actually comes from New York every week. And for a while, one of them came in from Philadelphia. Poor parents had to drive for 6 hours each way to come to the...
Worse than being a hockey parent.
That's rare. That's rare. No, the most of them are from around here. And what's interesting about them is that there's a very wide range of age, from 12 to 21. That means a 12-year-old is just beginning to be aware of adult issues, right? And music is about very adult issues, about love and death and sexuality and passion and frustration and triumph and all those great emotions. And a 12-year-old is beginning to feel those stirrings in their being. They're playing often the violin. They're not playing the tuba or the trombone. Those are instruments for older people. But they're very young, and then the 21-year-olds are already young professionals. Some of them are actually functioning as professionals. There's no other human activity which a 12-year-old and a 21-year-old can do together as equals. The last tour to South America was a very, very moving experience because we interacted with so many young South American kids from Peru and from Argentina and from Uruguay, playing together with them. And they were in most cases people from extremely poor backgrounds. But the music brought us together. And when we were playing music, there was no barrier, no division between the very privileged kids from America, who some of whom come from quite restricted backgrounds, because the musical gift is not according to the strata in the society. So people from very limited, culturally and education limited background can become very expert in music. Our first trumpet is an unbelievable player. He's probably the best young trumpeter in America. Everybody knows about him already. Elmer Churampi is a fantastic player. Well, he comes from a very, very poor family. Father is I met the whole family in Peru there. His father is a street musician, he plays in the street. But that doesn't limit this guy's talent. It's absolutely off the charts. And so when we were together with the young children in South America, we had an amazing amount of feeling of camaraderie, of equality, of shared passion and love for music, and great friendships were made, and then they went back to their homes in the barrios, and we came back to Boston, and the gulf is gigantic. But when the music is playing and when we're playing together, there is no gulf. And so what we realize from all of this is that human beings are actually as brothers, as Beethoven said in the Ninth Symphony, setting the words of Schiller, alle Menschen werden Brüder, all human beings will be brothers. And that's Beethoven's and Schiller's vision for human beings. The opposite of Donald Trump, who thinks that if you build a 30-foot wall, you'll solve the problems of the world. It's the opposite. We believe that you knock down the walls and create openings, connection, love, relationship, make music together, and all the barriers fall away. And so it's a very, very different approach to life. It's not based on fear, it's based on confidence, the confidence that human beings in their essence are good and want to succeed in enabling other people. What is it actually that makes our lives work? What makes us effective as human beings? And I don't necessarily mean happy, although happiness is a byproduct of being effective. If you live a life of contribution, there's a certain happiness that comes from that. If you live a life only in the model of success and failure, winning and losing, a great deal of your life is spent being very unhappy. Look at the stock market right now. Right, 3 days ago, everybody was beaming and happy because the stock market was high. Then suddenly it crashes, and everybody's miserable and fearful and desperate, and they shout at each other and so on. So, well, there's not much consistency in that. But the life of contribution doesn't depend on the stock market. So it's actually a more fulfilling world, and by inviting people into this environment and creating an environment at every rehearsal. And of course, I, as the leader, have to be extremely disciplined about how I treat them, how I interact with them. Because if I'm sarcastic, for instance, or if I'm reprimanding them, or I'm making them wrong, or I'm shouting at them, or any kind of putting down, making wrong, I destroy instantaneously the entire venture. Right. Instantaneously. So it's my job as the leader to at all times maintain not only upbeat but also gracious environment. And although it may be very intense and very passionate and very grueling sometimes to scale a mountain like the Mahler Ninth Symphony. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. And it's as difficult as it can be for an orchestra. But if I ever lose my head and forget and put people down or express myself in a negative way, it's amazing what happens. It destroys the atmosphere, it destroys the confidence. And so we have all sorts of strategies. Like, for instance, if somebody makes a mistake, instead of me angry with them, I say to them, say, how fascinating. They throw their hands in the air and say, how fascinating. And so then when people make a mistake, instead of feeling badly or feeling angry, they laugh and learn from the experience. How fascinating, meaning they can learn from the experience so that they don't make this mistake again. And we call it The Art of Possibility, and that's the name of the book, which my former wife, beautiful, wonderful Rosamund Zander, we wrote that together. Actually, she largely wrote it, but it's based on both our life works. She as a therapist and me as a conductor and teacher, and we put together a book of practices on how do you keep possibility alive and not allow the stresses and strains and fears of the downward spiral way of thinking to intrude on our natural desire and inclination to contribute to each other and to the world. And Roz has a new book, which is called Pathways to Possibility. It's the next stage. And I think she wrote that entirely on her own. That's her own work. And it's her life work. What it is essentially, without sounding too grand, is looking to the next evolution of human beings. We have evolved. I mean, there's no question about it, in spite of Harvey Weinstein. That we're a very much more developed species than we were 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years. There's no question about it. I mean, even in the last 20 years, human beings have evolved, and they're constantly evolving. And what we've been looking for and looking towards is the next evolution. What is it? What do we have to do? Who do we want to be for this extraordinary journey that we're on? Human beings are evolving. And I'm always saying that the next 30 years are going to be the most extraordinary 30 years in human history, certainly the most exciting period. And so we have to ask ourselves all the time, what kind of world do we want? And that what we're developing in that youth orchestra and in the grown-up orchestra in the Boston Philharmonic as well, it's a little bit less consistent because it meets for short, very intensive periods, rather than the youth orchestra, which meets over every week, over many, many months, and then goes on tour for 3 weeks. And so we have an intense interaction on a daily basis. And I write to them and they write to me, and so there's a constant interaction through the internet. And so I feel we're together looking at a new kind of institution, a new kind of environment, and a new way of being together as human beings. And it's a better model than the one that's out there in the world that we see on a daily basis. This is a particularly stark period under the Trump administration of that. It's just quite extraordinarily negative way that he has and the people around him have of dealing with problems and with each other. It's almost unheard of. But it's unprecedented. But it has one great advantage. It makes us clearer than we've ever been that that's not what we want. Those of us who are thoughtful and caring about human relationships and the way the society is functioning are disgusted by what we're seeing on a daily basis, and it makes us even more ferociously devoted to the values which are at the heart of this country and this culture. I don't mean just America, but the whole culture. And gradually the world is developing more and more towards that. And that's what we're developing. And the youth orchestra, I think of as a quite a beautiful workshop, a model for the way human beings can be. And you know what's fascinating is that what happens on Saturday afternoon in that room with those 124 kids spreads out into their families and into their friends. And I hear from people in a very, very wide range who are clearly being influenced and inspired and actually transformed by what's happening in that room on Saturday afternoon. And it's a very moving thing. And then I tell stories as I go, and I talk to IBM, or I talk to this company or that company, and then I tell the stories, and so it spreads and spreads, and the book, and so it's a beautiful thing. It's a constantly evolving and spreading story. And it is a story. It's an invented story. The story of possibility is invented, just like the story of competition and winning and losing and success and failure. That's another story. It's a very exciting story. We don't know. Something happens, and we immediately judge whether it was good or bad. You know, I was fired from my job at the conservatory after 45 years for a reason that had nothing to do with me. It had to do with somebody else. It doesn't matter what the politics of it were. But suddenly I was without a job, and it seemed like a catastrophe. I was 72 years old. I'd lost my youth orchestra, I'd lost my class, everything. It just was I still had the Boston Philharmonic, but everything that I had in my full-time job, then you taken away. And at 72, how can you do anything new? And of course I was very upset because I wasn't wise enough to see the correct response in the possibility mode would be, well, what's next? Sit in it and wait. And what was next was a new youth orchestra, which gave me the chance to create something from the ground up, thinking through every aspect of the organization which would fit the model of possibility. It created a new kind of institution. And now I'm 79, I'm feeling as happy and as fulfilled as I possibly could be. And who would have known? Who knows what the good news is and what the bad news is?
So what is next?
Well, that's a very good question. It isn't as if I'm going to do anything radically different. I think that when you get to the age of 79 or 80, I think one of the things that one is looking at is what kind of legacy am I leaving? And I'm thinking a lot about that, and the Boston Philharmonic is thinking a lot about that. These recordings that I'm putting out, for instance, the Beethoven Ninth, which is a radical rethinking of a work that everybody knows and is played probably more than any other work in the repertoire. This is going to be a radical rethinking of the piece, and it's going to affect people. And in each case, when I do a recording, I put a CD out together with this CD of the music in which I explain the music, and that's a full 80-minute CD in which I explain. I do that with all my recordings. For this one, it's going to be double that. It's going to be 2 CDs explaining the piece, which is hilarious. But actually, there's so much that I've accumulated in a lifetime of thinking about this music, this piece, this composer, that I think I can. In fact, I finished it. And it's a little bit like a detective story, although it's very long, 2.5 hours of listening. Somebody said to me the other day, it's like listening to a detective story, and so you can't put it down. You have to find out what's the next thing. So I'll be doing more of that, more recordings, and in each case leaving something as an explanation so that ordinary people who are not trained in music, can get access to these great composers and great compositions. And I'm doing a series of classes, interpretation classes, which are all on the internet. I do them at Saturday morning, and young musicians come together and I coach them, and then it goes on the internet, and hundreds of thousands of people are watching these films. 150,000 people here. That's a legacy, absolutely. And then the other thing that's happening, which is very exciting, is that we've hired somebody, a wonderful guy by the name of Johnny Hellier, whose full-time job is to work on the legacy. It's called the Zander Media Center, and all the things that I am doing and have done and will be doing in the media are going to be gathered together in a single website so that people can go and hear and find out about Beethoven, or they can find out about interpretation of music or rubato playing, or all the many different things that I've been fascinated by and put my attention on in a lifelong quest to understand music and life. That will all be in one place, and there people can go, and it'll be a playground.
You should do a podcast. Wait a minute, that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, that's what we're doing here.
Can you expand on your relationship with Beethoven? What makes him so special to you?
Well, Beethoven is, in all probability, the greatest composer who ever lived. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to say, because there are some strong rivals, Mozart and Bach particularly, and also Brahms. But then there's also Schubert and Schumann. I mean, there are Mahler, Bruckner. There are great composers who are like mountains so high that you can barely tell the difference between them. But the thing about Beethoven is that he had a wider range of musical compositions at the highest level than any other composer, whether it's string quartets or the symphonies or the sonatas or the piano sonatas, even the opera. he was at the highest level in all these arenas. And so I think the effect he's had on people is probably the greatest. I mean, the string quartets of Beethoven are the pinnacle of what the string quartet. Mozart's quartets are great, the Haydn quartets are many of them great, but the Beethoven quartet, and Bartók is great and Brahms is great, but Beethoven at the center of the string quartet. Piano sonatas, the same thing. The Beethoven piano, 32 piano sonatas, Mozart wrote piano sonatas, Brahms wrote, Schumann wrote, Beethoven at the pinnacle. Do you see what I mean? Symphonies, the same thing. 9 symphonies of Beethoven, the pinnacle of the symphony. So that makes him the most richly contributory, I mean, I don't know how to say it, just the greatest impact on the world. And his music, since it's in a form that everybody can grasp and everybody can be moved by, I mean, it's an extraordinary idea when you think of it. Here's a man who's near death, deaf, unhappy in love, no companions, alone, ill, with many different diseases, and he writes a symphony for all humanity, and which every single human being virtually can sing the tune of the Ninth Symphony. I mean, it's an extraordinary idea that this isolated man was able to speak for all humanity, and there isn't anybody who doesn't know about it. You know, the Ninth Symphony, the opening of the Fifth Symphony, everybody knows it. So it's become the language of music, is Beethoven. And what I'm fascinated by is the range of his emotional expression. He's not alone in that, but his fury and his struggles and his pointing towards triumph. You know, every piece of Beethoven ends in triumph. Every one. However much suffering, however much struggle there is, however much despair and anguish and anger, in the end there's always a pathway to triumph, with one exception, and that's one overture, Coriolan overture, where he ends in despair, because the story of Coriolan ends with suicide. But other than that, there's always a pathway forward. And that's a very inspiring idea. So from darkness to light, that's the essential pathway for human beings. All human beings want to go on that path. We live in a world of possibility of being joined, like the roots of the aspen tree are joined under the earth. They look separate, but actually they're one organism, or the whole forest of trees is one organism. That I can understand for human beings. That's what Beethoven was writing about. And he found a mode of expression which was all-embracing and universal, and everybody can accept it. And of course, I believe that eventually people will be drawn more and more and more towards those great visionary artists and creators and composers like Beethoven and Bach and Schubert and Mozart, who had that capacity to see in a visionary way beyond the limitations of individual separation and conflict and winning and losing and all that nonsense that we can. I mean, that's fun, having a game and fighting against the opposition. I loved the Patriots and the Eagles fighting together. But what matters is not who wins. What matters is the strength, the struggle, the intellectual display of brilliance. I mean, it's just mind-blowing what those people achieve, the coaches and the quarterbacks. And, I mean, that's art. That's fantastic stuff. And I think the greatest composers like Beethoven, have taken the human conversation to a very, very high level. And it's our job to bring it alive and make it passionate and vital and accessible and exciting and heartwarming for all human beings. My job, I feel, is to enable people to get access to their heart, access to the information and knowledge and culture that is available, access to each other, access to audiences, access to music. Just make the greatness of our life available to as many people as possible. That's what I plan to do for the rest of my life.
And many thanks to Ben Zander for joining us this time on Take Me Through It. To learn more about Ben, the Orchestras, and what he's been up to and what he will be up to over the next couple of months, just go to benjaminzander.com. benjaminzander.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for downloading. Remember, you can always reach us at bj@takemethroughit.com, bj@takemethroughit.com, or just leave us a message on wherever you are listening to this podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm BJ Fennell. Take Me Through It is a production of Fennell Communications, LLC.